Happy Friday, everyone. Going to be discussing some leadership action today. Hey, Dana, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Dr. Rick?
Yeah, that was super smooth. You logged on super fast. Was that easy?
Yes, I had the best trainer in the world. So thank you very much for our practice run. Sorry if we bothered people in that, but it's great to see you and looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome, awesome. I'm going to do a brief intro just while everyone's logging on here. We have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Dana Bourne. She's a professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, chair of the Senior Executive Fellows Program at the Harvard Center for Leadership, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Her story is absolutely amazing. Dr. Bourne is a retired brigadier general with 30 years of service in the U.S. Air Force. Prior to coming to Harvard, she served 2 terms as the dean of the faculty of the United States Air Force Academy, where she was also professor and head of the leadership department. Previously, Dana served as an exchange officer with the Royal Australian Air Force, assistant director for the Secretary of Defense, deputy chief of the personal issues team for the Air Force, aide and speechwriter to the Secretary of the Air Force, and squadron commander for the 11th Mission Support Squadron in Operation Enduring Freedom. She is a graduate with distinction of the U.S. Air Force Academy and received numerous awards, including Penn State's University Alumni Fellow Award and Distinguished Alumni Award. She won the Air Force's Zuckert Award for Outstanding Management Achievement. She also won Air Force Association's Vandenberg Award for Outstanding Contributions to Aerospace Education and the Air Force's Distinguished Service Medal, Legion of Merit and Defense Service Medal. She also won, there's so many here, but we're almost done. Harvard Kennedy School Annual Dean's Teaching Award, as well as the Harvard Kennedy School's Innovation in Teaching Award. She is also a Distinguished Moral Leadership Fellow. So here to discuss the ever important topic of leadership, the art of it, how we become better leaders, and what the importance is. So again, Dana, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me on. I look forward to your questions.
All right. Well, we're going to get right into it, which I think one of the big questions people have, in your opinion, are leaders born or are leaders made?
That's a great question. I think many people ask that, and I say both. Because obviously to be a leader you have to have been born and come into some livelihood to influence, but I also think leaders are made, and leaders have to be learners. I think we all know that, and so if you're not learning, one should not be leading, and so they're made as well.
Interesting. And what do you think makes a great leader? If you could name the top 3 characteristics that all great leaders have.
I think that you could come up with a lot of lists from many different people, but mine would be character, competence, and courage. Uh, I think leadership and character go together. That you can be a great leader, but and get people to take the hill, but maybe people wouldn't trust you in other aspects. Or you could be a great person of character, but can't get people to take the hill. And so both leadership and character, I think, go hand in hand, and they're connected. I think competence is important, and that's partly what are we good at, and how do we lean into our strengths and focus on being even better in our strengths. And that competence is important as we look to people, and being the best in our trade that we can be. And then finally, the courage piece, the root word cur is heart. And so, that heart, that courage, physically, morally, in every way, psychologically, it's important to be courageous, to put ourselves out there to influence for good.
Now, you talk about courage, you talk about heart. Do great leaders lead with their minds or their heart or both?
Both. I'm a both and person. You're probably picking up on that. I think
Uh-huh.
that, yeah, the best leaders lead connecting the head with the heart.
And they lead, and then talk about, you mention often that it's important to show emotion when you're a leader. No one wants to follow a robot, and having that human aspect, being vulnerable, having emotions, knowing who you are is a critical aspect of becoming a leader. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, boy, that's a loaded question, and I'm going to answer it in a couple of ways. One is emotion is human, and that emotion is important. And sometimes we think about emotion with the term empathy, which is an emotional intelligence skill. It's do we know what it's like to walk in the moccasins of another, and also in their head, right? It's perspective taking. Do I understand how you're thinking about something, as well as how are you feeling about something? I think that's a critically important part of us being a caring person, seeing the humanity in another person. Now, emotion, though, is a wrestling thing. I mean, certainly as a woman in the military and a senior officer, wrestling with emotion, like I had to be self-monitoring on how I expressed my emotion, having to present a flag to the family of a fallen member on behalf of the president is not an easy thing. I cry at grocery store ribbon cuttings, right? So I had to learn how to manage my emotion that was appropriate for the event, but not to be inhuman and to not show that it was hard.
So let's talk a little bit about you back in the Air Force, because that's such a great story. Being a woman in the Air Force, being obviously a clear leader, people looking up to you, how did you balance leading with your heart, leading with your mind, the emotional game, showing emotions, being human, yet obviously being strong at the same time?
Boy, I'm not sure I did it really well all the time. And I think that's part of being a leader too, is recognizing that, it's not failure necessarily, but recognizing we're not perfect, and that iterating is learning. And so I didn't do that well. There were a lot of times that I kind of took things more personally than I should have. And I think one of the things that helped me stay on track was thinking about the greater purpose. Why are we here? We get out of our emotions sometimes when we go into, out of that fight or flight or freeze when something's really tough. And we're more able to get into, and this in your profession, when you start thinking about yourself as I'm the general officer, I'm the commander, I'm the doctor, I'm the surgeon, it's easier to step out of that debilitating emotion and go into what's more role and delivering your competency for the greater mission.
And then you talk about kind of the aspects of fear versus respect. And that's another very common question amongst leaders. Is it better to be feared or respected as a leader? Does your team work better and to a higher level if they fear you or if they respect you?
I'm absolutely 110% respect. And I think that building trust and mutual respect is absolutely critical. And I don't think fear is. I think that I think maybe I'm just retitling that fear that you might be thinking about there as maybe mutual respect.
Yeah, I mean, how do you build that respect? How do you get that trust and the respect so people who you're working with don't want to disappoint you? That's the main driver.
Yeah, I think that respect is high standards, holding people, supporting people. I had one commander who I really have embraced, who said, my role is to be your top cover, your advocacy, and your support. And with that, it's like, but I'm going to hold you to, I'm going to, empower you, but, ultimately, I'm accountable and I'm responsible. And so we're tethered together here. But I think that's more of a relationship. Learning about people's life stories, I think really listening to each other helps to develop that. I think people who treat people as equals in some sense, that as a human, maybe, you're in a position of higher authority, but you still have respect of the humanity of the other person in both directions. That's mutual respect also. So I guess that's partly how you build that trust and being authentic. If somebody is trying to come across as being like, as my resume would suggest, gosh, she's just had a beautiful, like, meteoric career. Well, no, there's a lot of ups and downs throughout that whole journey. And when people hear some of those, they see more the human part of that journey and can relate a little bit closer. So I think that's where realness and authenticity comes in.
So you use the word authentic, and people talk about authentic leadership and then inauthentic leadership. Give us an example of inauthentic leadership versus authentic.
Yeah, I think inauthentic leadership is when I try to be Sheryl Sandberg or Jack Welch or Steve Jobs. That's not me, and or Patton. And so inauthentic is when you're trying to be someone else. Authentic is when you're embracing who you are and why you are, and you learn from others' examples and you try them on as if, I want to learn and I want to try, but you're still operating from your place of your distinctive purpose. That's authentic leadership.
So it's about knowing who you are. And just going back to what you said before, the humble factor, which people often say, even if you're in a position of authority, being humble and understanding that we're all human and relating to people that you're working with at the same level, bringing yourself down and understanding that people are all human and inspiring through humility. How important do you think that is?
I think humility is incredibly important as a virtue of a leader. And I think there's lots of different definitions of humility. I think of the virtue of humility as service, because I think humility isn't thinking less of ourselves, but thinking of ourselves less. I think someone has been saying, but it's also, humility is really about service. And not only am I growing to learn to be the best person I can be, but I'm also invested in lifting others up, serving others, a greater calling. That's humility.
Yeah. And do you feel like everyone, if they work at it and if they're focused, can become a leader?
Absolutely. And I actually, in interviewing to be the dean of the faculty at the Air Force Academy, was asked by the Secretary of the Air Force at the time, do you believe everybody can become a leader? And my answer back was, absolutely, Mr. Secretary. And then I said, but I had to tell a joke, which was very risky in an interview, but because I said, if I didn't, I shouldn't be the next dean at the Air Force Academy. But I said, how the question or the joke is, how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? And the punchline is, yeah, you could take a guess. I've heard lots of different versions. I won't put you through that though.
Yeah, please.
But if you know it, you got it.
No, I don't. I definitely don't.
All right. Thank you for giving me the opportunity then. It's just one, but the light bulb has to want to change.
Interesting. Okay. Makes sense. There
And
you go.
yeah, so if we believe that we can learn and grow, then anybody can become and grow into advancing, exercising leadership as a leader. It's not a position of authority, it's a process of influencing. However, if somebody believes they're not, then the likelihood is they're not going to be. So that's kind of my caveat.
I mean, it's also important to realize when we think of the word leadership, we think of the president of the USA, but we're all leaders in our own worlds, whether it's our job, our family, our hobbies. People have different leadership roles. And I guess explain that leadership is all relative. Doesn't mean you're running the country.
That is correct. Now, we do need people in positions of authority, right? Every company needs a CEO, a hospital needs somebody running the hospital, we need generals and admirals. But what we want is people who are exercising, I would say, moral authority in positions of authority. And we need people who are willing to step up every moment of every day to influence. One of my colleagues at the business school says, a janitor in an elementary school can be a leader if they own a situation, take action and add distinctive value in exercising their duties. So we shouldn't be handicapped by the fact that we have to have a title, people that work for us, a parking place, the C-suite, whatever. Every one of us has the opportunity to exercise leadership every day.
And then you talk a lot about balancing the me versus the we, meaning that a leader, like you said, has to be competent. You have to be very good at what you do, or else no one's going to follow you. But how do you balance the me versus the we, elevating yourself and at the same time elevating your entire team?
Yes, I appreciate that question so much because especially people in the health profession, but I think for most people, we go right to what gives us meaning, and that's serving, a bigger cause, organization, a calling, and we don't spend enough time thinking about me and I. And I do think there's an I and a me and team, but you shouldn't stop there. So how do we develop knowing about ourselves, our self-awareness and acceptance? My values, what are they? How do I prioritize them? What motivates me intrinsically, extrinsically? Who's on my support team? All of these things are really ourselves growing. Who am I? Why am I? But we don't want to hang out in that space because then we're operating from ego, which we all have. What pulls us into the operating in the we is our purpose. And when we go to our purpose, then we're operating for that service, that humility to a cause or something. So we bring our strategy to something bigger, but we got to include the I and the me in that journey to we.
Yeah, so it's important to focus on your strengths, and you elevate the team, but you have to know your own value first and kind of what you bring to the table.
Oh, absolutely. And interest then in terms of, a matter of fact, I've shared with people that most of the teaching that I do is really trying to help people really identify what are your strengths, what are your capacities, and what are the things that really inspire you and motivate you, and how do we build on that? And boy, we can really make a difference in that area. If we try to identify weaknesses and spend so much time like on those weaknesses, we barely move the needle. And in that meantime, we are basically wasting and taking time away from the strengths. We can surround ourselves. We have to know what our weaknesses are because we don't want to fall prey to them, but we also don't want to waste time. We hire somebody who that's their strength, right? We bring somebody around us that can, round us out in terms of what is not our strength. I call it not a weakness, but a lesser strength.
And people talk about how leaders need to take accountability for the team and be decisive, meaning if there's an important decision that affects the entire team, typically the leader of that team makes that decision, and whether it's right or wrong, they take the fall or the credit and the accountability. Talk about the importance of accountability when you're a leader and not blaming those below you.
It is so important. And it's also, how you do whatever's going well and what's not going as well. You could probably envision this, but just think about an example of, a Marine platoon, for example. They train, they do their mission, and everything's going well. When things go well, hey, platoon, you're doing great. When things don't go well behind closed doors, there's a private conversation happening, but in front, it's like taking responsibility, accountability. But then even when it's like for the decision point of it, you're out in the field and you have something that goes disastrous, right? Like we've seen in many of our counterinsurgencies, all the troops are looking, saying, now what, Lieutenant? And you got to make decisions. It's on you. The rose is on you. And you've got to be decisive with how you are going to approach whatever that novel situation is. And teamwork doesn't happen without really capitalizing and orienting people's strengths towards that mission achievement.
Now, what if people don't like making difficult decisions? I know a lot of people who, if there's a tough question, tough decision made, they would rather defer to someone else. Now, the world needs people like that. Not everyone wants to take the final shot in the basketball game, so to speak. Are those people leaders? Can they become leaders? Is that just an inherent limitation?
Yeah, I've seen so many. I'm watching some great questions coming in too, in terms of, even friendships, because not every one of these scenarios is the same. If you're, you have to let go someone who's become a very good colleague, but because of the circumstances, the news you have to deliver is really difficult. As a commander, I had to do that where even from one of my classmates, I had to fly back from overseas and basically remove their clearance and basically they had to leave the Air Force. But it was like but the last thing I would want to do in that is to treat them disrespectfully and to have them go take their life because of that, right? Thinking that this was, an embarrassing, unrecoverable. And so, doing this with the compassion of saying, it's unfortunate we've gotten to this situation, but explaining this is the why, I've had to make the decision I've had to make. Or sending people to jail. I've had to do that as well. And, when their families are counting on them for lots of things, it's painful, but it's like, treating with compassion, I think, is important, but holding up the highest standards is also incredibly important.
So, along those friendship lines and people you're working with, how do great leaders deal with confrontation? Clearly, you're running some sort of business, some sort of team. There's a confrontation. Someone's not doing their job to the level that they need to. They are incompetent. How do you confront people and either try to elevate them or realize that it's too big of a job for them and then let them go?
Yeah, I think this is a very good question as well. I'd like to answer it from a framing that I've gotten out of the negotiations project at the Harvard Law School. A lot of work on, the people who, getting to yes, and, how do you negotiate? Because truthfully, it's like a negotiation. And in that process, there's a lot of traps we can fall into. Like, I have the truth, or you have the truth, or I'm to blame, or you're to blame, or, when in fact, anytime there's a confrontation type situation, there's usually both perspectives matter in trying to resolve the problem solving to come up with the way ahead. There's a term used for that called reflective engagement, which requires a whole lot of listening, a whole lot of inquiry, because oftentimes we will jump right to what we think is going on, where we're not spending the time to wrestle with the nuance of what really is the root issue here. And so I think reflective engagement, curiosity, listening is critically important. I mean, so many of us have heard that, there's a reason we have two ears and one mouth. Really trying to get at inquiry, not in confrontation to win, but to get to a negotiated problem-solving step ahead.
And then at some point, if you realize that it's a no-win situation and they either can't do the job to the level that you need it done, at that point, for the better of the team, you have to make a tough decision and send them on their way.
Absolutely, yes. And I mean, those are difficult too, because there are times where, somebody shows up to work in the morning and we're taking their badge and giving them a box and escorting them out. And those are really difficult times, but those usually are pretty easy to say, the values of this organization, there's been some real break of trust. And, sometimes it's been the organization lack of trust, right? And you have to go say, I'm sorry, and bring somebody back. But oftentimes it's where you are having to let somebody go. But it's the right thing for the organization's values. It's that something has been misaligned.
I guess sorry, go on.
Oh, that's okay. I was just going to share a little wisdom that another senior officer gave me, which I found good. If somebody's not performing well, the first question to ask is, have I been clear in my expectations? And if I have, the second is, have I provided for this individual the appropriate training? And if the answer is yes, then is there something happening in their lives right now where maybe they're not able to focus or perform to the level that they normally do? And if there's nothing, then it's like, it's time to say goodbye. But there's a series of questions there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the summary is being a leader is not easy. There's a lot of moments that are tough, they're difficult, and they are frankly uncomfortable. But being a leader requires you dealing with uncomfortable situations, because if you're not going to do it as the leader, no one else will.
That's exactly right. And that's where this self-awareness and acceptance is in your own values and aligning your values with the organization's values. And that's critical. And it's better to know what they are and what your ethical boundaries are before you're in a situation where you then have to act. And I know you have plenty of those.
Absolutely. It's a daily basis. So, people think of leaders as being perfect. They envision them as, having no imperfections, wonderful and everything. But you talk about how great leaders are vulnerable, and great leaders have past failures, and great leaders don't downplay their failures. They actually learn from them and they focus on them. Can you go into that a little bit?
I can, because vulnerability is a word that most people think about as being a weakness. And I think we all experience vulnerability from others as actually a strength. You know, we feel real connected, more connected. Trust goes up. Brene Brown, I know many people are familiar with her work. She has a TED Talk on vulnerability that if you Google and watch it, you won't watch it just once. But it's incredibly, when you hear somebody else's journey, and I, you know, we very rarely ask for help because we don't want to appear like we don't know what we're doing. But when somebody asks you for help or advice, you feel wonderful, don't you? You feel like, wow, I have something that they care that I have to offer. But we don't do that enough. And I found one place in my career where I needed help and advice, and I was so vulnerable that I went to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, who's the top ranking military, and said, sir, I really need to share this with you. And he went on to share one of his stories that afterwards I felt like, oh, mine is so little. I feel like I'm so sorry for bothering you. You know, it's almost like when he was vulnerable when I was vulnerable enough to ask for advice and help, he returned with his vulnerability because he was still active as the Chief of Staff. And afterwards I felt like, sir, I've got nothing. Mine's nothing compared to yours. But it was amazing, that connection. I still to this day admire him and respect him so much for that vulnerability that he reciprocated.
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful story right there. It's when you're in your worst moment and realizing that everyone has those moments that make you realize that you can move on. And talking about team, because I think surrounding yourself, you know, great leaders surround themselves with a great team. They don't operate alone or in a vacuum. And there's a common saying that if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. You need to be in a room where you're challenged and where you surround yourself with really great people that elevate the entire team. Talk how great leaders build teams around them.
Yes, and actually I will talk to that. You also have a comment that came in, however, of, you know, what if when you're vulnerable, people use that against you? And I've learned this through the hard way, is that that's telling, and it may break trust of you with that organization or that person. But ultimately, advice I try to follow is don't allow other people to have you be somebody you're not. And so, you know, but you learn, because then if there's then trust with that person might, you know, you have to forgive and forget, but at the same time maybe be self-monitoring a little bit in the future, you know, in that organization or with that person. But that's a very great question. But to go back to leading forward, I forgot your question again. You're gonna have to give it back.
Oh, it's okay. No, we were talking about how do great leaders form great teams?
Great teams. Oh, so I think trust is going to be incredibly important, but I also think unifying around a shared vision and mission and purpose of why you're doing what you're doing, and helping people figure out what are their distinctive contributions. Matter of fact, some of the great research in this area by a guy by the name of Richard Hackman at Harvard, he's passed now, but even in operating teams, in orchestras, in airline crews, the person who is kind of in an authorized leadership position, who helps people see how they fit with the greater mission, those are the teams that outperform other teams. So the airline pilot who gets the stewardesses together and, you know, the navigator, everybody's kind of going, here's, you know, they're just meeting, right, for the first time, right before the mission. It's those that create the connective tissue before they perform together that outperformed other teams. So the leader has a role, but that role is really the connecting the tissue between the individuals towards that mission and that vision of what they're there to accomplish.
I mean, that's just so wonderfully put. It's been half an hour. I know you're super busy. I'm going to wrap up by just asking you one last question. You know, what do you suggest for just the normal person who might be listening to this to become a better leader? What are some simple pieces of advice for regular people, not deans of the Air Force or professors at Harvard, but people who are living their normal lives? How can we all become better leaders?
Well, it's an easy one for me to answer. I'm at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, and John F. Kennedy has a great quote that says, learning and leading are indispensable to each other. And the easy answer is be a learner. You are already in an opportunity to lead and to influence, even in a casual interaction of every single day. But as we invest ourselves in learning, learning about ourselves, and learning about others, reading, listening, the kind of thing you're doing here, listen to your podcast. There's so much there in terms of advancing ourselves as leaders, from the I and the me to we. And we need everybody to operate from their distinctive place of strength in this world in so many ways.
Listen, Dr. Bourne, thank you for your time. Unbelievable. I could talk to you for the entire afternoon. I find this topic absolutely riveting. Thank you for giving us all these pearls. Just like you said, leadership is an art. Not everyone is born that way. And no matter who we are, no matter what we do, we can always perfect this craft, learn the different skills that you've talked about. And hopefully everyone can kind of put that to work. And again, I appreciate everything you do for us in this country.
I agree. Thank you for all that you do. And thank you for your listeners who are on this learning and leading journey with us. I wish you well. Stay safe.
All right. Take care, Dana. Have a wonderful afternoon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.